My guest again today is Lynne Balzer.
Well, I'm going to cover the financial aspects of this because I had a feeling that's really what was a lot of it was. And I got some big surprises. So I'm just going to present the evidence and let people draw their own conclusions. And hopefully they'll want to check into this more. I'm sure you're aware that an immense amount of resources are being spent on climate change all over the world. We're talking about not just billions, but trillions. That's thousands of billions or millions of millions of dollars. Stephen Moore of the Heritage Foundation calls the machine pushing the scam the climate change industrial complex. Many people are getting very rich on climate change. So because this money is coming out of our pockets, isn't it time that we investigated how in the world this all got started? There's a powerful financial incentive for scientists to conclude that an impending climate crisis is in the works. Without fires, a fireman wouldn't have a job. Without an impending climate crisis, a climate scientist also wouldn't have a job. Without a climate crisis, these scientists wouldn't receive grants from governments and major foundations. And it's interesting that there are now thousands of climate scientists. 50 years ago, there were none. At that time, the climate was studied only by physicists and meteorologists. 50 years ago, universities didn't even offer majors in climate science. Science Direct analyzed the data showing competitive research grants between the years 1950 and 2021. And there were 4.3 million awards given, totaling $1.3 trillion. That's 1,300 billion. Between 2018 and 2023, a period of 5 years, $6.4 trillion was spent on efforts to push back against perceived climate change, known as climate change mitigation. As Stephen Moore pointed out, for the huge amount of money that's already been spent on climate change, quote, we could feed everyone on the planet, end malaria, and provide clean water and reliable electricity to every remote village in Africa, and we probably have enough money left over to find a cure for cancer and Alzheimer's. But the climate change experts are telling us that between now and 2030, which is another 5-year period, almost 5 times that amount, or $7.4 trillion per year, for a total of $37 trillion will be required to keep Earth's temperature increase from exceeding the magic number, which is 1.5 degrees Celsius. According to Dr. Ed Berry, the climate fraud is costing the United States $1 trillion every 100 days. This staggering figure amounts to $3.65 trillion per year. The federal government took in $4.9 trillion, just for a basis of comparison there. Cap and trade, or emissions trading, is a government-sponsored regulatory program designed to limit or cap a company's emissions of a gas. A government sets a limit or cap on the amount of emissions that each company is allowed to produce without paying a penalty. This cap is then gradually reduced as the years go by. So each year, the company would be allowed to emit less and less gas without a penalty. This quota is divided into units for which the government issues permits called carbon credits or allowances. A carbon credit is a certificate that gives a company the right to emit 1 metric ton, that's 1,000 kilograms of carbon dioxide gas. The company must obtain enough of these credits or allowances to cover the total amount of emissions they produce, either from the government or by trading with other firms. And sometimes these are even auctioned off. This is what the trade part in cap and trade refers to. If a company has been able to lower its emissions particularly well, it can sell its spare allowances, called banking allowances, to another company or save them for future needs. So if your company emits less gas than the limit you were given, you can keep your unused credits or sell them to a company that needs them. So company A didn't produce that much, and they had some extra permits, which they then sold to company B. So Company B is paying Company A for that because they're producing more gas. So that's the whole idea of the cap and trade. The first cap and trade program involved acid rain. During the 1970s and 1980s, there was a big media-fueled acid rain scare. The media told us that sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide gases emitted by utility companies in the Midwest were damaging forests and lakes in the eastern United States, since air masses in the United States move from west to east. Well, nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide react with water in the atmosphere to form nitric acid and sulfuric acid, and they are real pollutants. But carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. So anyway, here's where they all get started, and then they move up into the atmosphere, join with water, and turn into acids, and then they get deposited over here. In 1980, the United States government set up a 10-year acid precipitation assessment program, costing $500 million to investigate this problem. Alarm over acid rain that was spread by the media allowed governments to pass regulations governing the sale of sulfur dioxide permits. Realizing how environmental concerns amplified by the media could generate big bucks, Senators John Hines of Pennsylvania and Timothy Worth of Colorado co-sponsored a bill known as Project 88. This legislation was geared to create a new market for buying and selling sulfur dioxide permits. Project 88 morphed into the Clean Air Act of 1990. We're in a war for a safer, cleaner environment, and the environment is losing. That's why we need to harness incentives and market forces in the battle. Strategies which Senator Worth and I have outlined in Project 88 will help our nation to move further, faster, at far less cost, and that was John Hines. Although the media discussed this nonstop, these acid rain fears proved to be largely unjustified. Just 2 species of trees found at a high altitude suffered any substantial damage. The acidity of the water in lakes was later attributed to natural causes. The scientists who studied this problem concluded that there were no easy answers. A prominent scientist and head of the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, Dr. Roger Revelle, established the International Geophysical Year, that's IGY, in 1957, during which measurements of carbon dioxide began. Dr. Revelle wrote the first modern scientific paper linking human carbon dioxide emissions to rising temperatures. This triggered an avalanche of climate research and the beginning of the global warming frenzy. The Earth's average temperature had risen a few degrees from the end of the Little Ice Age in the 1800s to a high in the 1930s. Then it cooled off again, even though the percentage of carbon dioxide was still rising. In the 1960s, Al Gore was a student in one of Dr. Revelle's classes at Harvard University. Gore was so impressed by Revelle's hypothesis on global warming that he wrote about it in his 1992 book, Earth in the Balance. This book led to his documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, an Oscar and a Nobel Peace Prize. The global warming story gained attention through incessant propaganda and a congressional hearing that Senator Al Gore organized in 1988. The scheduling and staging of this hearing was carefully planned. In a PBS Frontline interview, Senator Tim Worth later bragged about how they did this. Quote, "We called the Weather Bureau and found out what was historically the hottest day of the summer, so we scheduled the hearing for that day." That was June 23rd, by the way. And bingo, it was the hottest day on record in Washington, or close to it. We went in the night before and opened all the windows so that the air conditioning wasn't working inside the room. And so when the hearing occurred, there was not only bliss, which is television cameras in double figures, but it was really hot. So Hansen's giving this testimony. You've got these television cameras back there, heating up the room. and the air conditioning in the room didn't appear to work. So it was sort of a perfect collection of events that happened that day, with the wonderful Hansen, who was wiping his brow at the witness table and giving this remarkable testimony. The star witness, James Hansen of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, that's GISS, who was a climate activist, gave a memorable performance. Hansen claimed that he was 99% certain that the Earth was warmer than at any time in the history of instrumental measurements. That was a bald-faced lie. The climate was warmer during the 1930s, but they were hoping people wouldn't remember that. Ironically, Dr. Revelle was having 7 thoughts about the influence of carbon dioxide in 1988. And after the memorable congressional hearing on that hot June day, he wrote letters expressing his doubts to some members of Congress, one of whom was Senator Tim Wirth. Wirth ignored his letter. In early 1991, Dr. Revelle co-authored an article with Dr. Fred Singer entitled, quote, "What to Do About Greenhouse Warming, Look Before You Leap," published in Cosmos magazine. In this article, he and Dr. Singer expressed strong doubts about the global warming hypothesis. They urged more research before any remedial action would be taken. In 1991, Dr. Revelle gave a last speech of his life at Bohemian Grove in California, where the nation's most powerful men assembled, apologizing for his climate research that had sent so many in the wrong direction. He expressed his worries about political fallout from Al Gore and the IPCC. He knew that the science was flawed. Just a short time later, he died of a heart attack. On July 6, 1992, an article by Greg Easterbrook of Newsweek magazine discussed the article that Drs. Revelle and Singer had written. In this article, he wrote that in his book, Earth in the Balance, Al Gore claimed that Dr. Revelle, as his mentor at Harvard, had introduced him to the problem of climate change. But, he noted, Earth in the Balance does not mention that before his death last year, Revelle published a paper that concludes, quote, "The scientific basis for greenhouse warming is too uncertain to justify drastic action at this time. There is little risk in delaying policy responses." When this discrepancy between Senator Gore's book and Dr. Revelle's article was raised during the 1992 vice presidential debate, Gore responded that Dr. Revelle's statements had been taken completely out of context. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Justin Lancaster called Dr. Singer and demanded that he remove Dr. Revelle's name from the article that they had written together. Dr. Singer said that was impossible, since he would need Dr. Revelle's permission, and since Dr. Revelle had died, he couldn't give it. So Dr. Lancaster and Anthony Sauci, a member of Gore's staff, spread the false story that Dr. Singer had added Dr. Revelle's name to the article to give it credence. They claimed that Dr. Revelle was too feeble and senile to have written it. To counter these false and damaging statements, Dr. Singer had no other option but to sue Dr. Lancaster for libel. Dr. Singer learned that Lancaster had been fully aware of Dr. Revelle's contribution to the article. And furthermore, Dr. Revelle's calendar in the months before his death showed a full schedule of speaking engagements, conferences, and travel. This indicated that Dr. Revelle was not a cognitively impaired invalid, as Lancaster and Sauci were claiming. In February of 1994, journalist Ted Koppel revealed on his TV program Nightline that Al Gore had asked him to investigate the political and economic forces behind the, quote, anti-environmental movement, especially that several skeptical scientists had received money from the coal industry. Ted Koppel asked Gore, "Is this a case of industry supporting scientists who happen to hold sympathetic views? Or are scientists adapting their views to accommodate industry?" Ted Koppel I'm sorry. Okay, the attempt to use Mr. Koppel to vilify skeptical scientists brought criticism down on the vice president. Dr. Lancaster's attorneys indicated that they were ready to have him sign a retraction and apology for the lies he had told about Dr. Singer. And you may have also heard about Enron, the Enron scandal, and that was one of the biggest bankruptcy cases in U.S. history. In the 1990s, Enron held over $60 billion in assets and was doing $1 billion in business per week. Due to fraud, this company collapsed in 2001, along with Arthur Andersen LLP, one of the largest auditing and accounting companies in the world. This scandal involved a series of accounting irregularities, including the use of off-the-books partnerships to hide debts and inflate profits. 22 people were convicted and jailed for their actions related to that scandal. In the early 1990s, Enron had been the major trader in the $20 billion per year sulfur dioxide cap and trade market. The profits it made on these trades caused Enron's stock to rise significantly. And then came the inevitable question, what next? Well, how about a carbon dioxide cap and trade program, they wondered. Enron recognized this as a dream opportunity. After all, since the cap and trade market for sulfur dioxide was already in place, why not do the same for carbon dioxide, which was being blamed for the climate crisis? Enron operated a vast network of natural gas pipelines. Because coal-fired power plants emit more CO2 than natural gas, its CEO, Ken Lay, saw the opportunity to make immense profits on carbon trading with the coal companies. Coal-burning utilities would have to pay billions for carbon credits because they emit more carbon dioxide than natural gas facilities do. This would give Enron a competitive advantage. Enron and other natural gas companies could make a fantastic amount of money selling credits and also their own energy at higher prices. Enron executives began working with Vice President Gore, and they even gave James Hansen of NASA. They hired him as a consultant. And later, the Heinz Foundation, headed by Teresa Heinz Kerry, who's John Kerry's wife, awarded Hansen $250,000. Now, John Kerry, of course, became the Biden administration's climate czar. But unless carbon dioxide was designated a pollutant, its emissions couldn't be capped. As the newly elected vice president in the Clinton administration in 1993, Al Gore latched onto the idea of a globalist environmental regulatory system. At the same time, Enron lobbied President Clinton and Congress to give the Environmental Protection Agency the authority to declare carbon dioxide a pollutant. And this is detailed in Larry Bell's book, Climate Corruption. Enron's CEO, Ken Lay, worked closely with Wirth, who was now Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs in the Clinton-Gore administration, to lobby Congress to grant the EPA the regulatory authority to declare carbon dioxide a pollutant. Carbon dioxide wasn't actually declared a pollutant until 2007, when the Supreme Court did it, and it was also declared a pollutant by the EPA in 2009. From 1994 to 1996, the Enron Foundation gave almost $1 million to the Nature Conservancy, which was pushing global warming alarmism. Enron also gave $1.5 million to other environmental groups and developed close ties with groups like Greenpeace. At the same time, its directors were working closely with the Clinton administration to disseminate global warming propaganda. Enron bought the largest wind power company in the world, GE Wind, from General Electric. Enron also bought the world's largest solar power company in a joint venture with SolarX. And they gave research grants to scientists with the understanding that their reports would assign blame for global warming to human carbon dioxide emissions. And some of their own scientists even started to doubt that global warming hypothesis. In 1997, before the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, an Enron attorney, Christopher Horner, was appointed Director of Relations with the federal government. Horner reported that on the second day at this job, he was told that Enron's prime objective was to obtain an international treaty imposing cuts in carbon dioxide emissions. And an internal Enron memorandum stated that Kyoto would, quote, do more to promote Enron's business than almost any other regulatory initiative outside the restructuring of the energy and natural gas industries in Europe and the United States. So that tells you a lot, doesn't it? It turns out that it was the Kyoto Protocol that was passed on December 11th, 1997, that established the cap and trade carbon markets. It required industrialized nations to cut their emissions by an average of 5% below 1990 levels. And it was Enron that pushed hardest for this agreement for its own benefit. Due to propaganda and pressure, governments went along with this. It set binding emissions reduction targets for 37 industrialized countries and economies in transition, and the European Union called Annex B countries. The Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, was set up to allow developmentally advanced countries to invest in emission reduction projects in developing countries. For this, they could earn Certified Emission Reduction Credits, CERs. They're really great with the acronyms, right? That would meet their own greenhouse gas reduction targets. The Kyoto Protocol didn't have strong mechanisms for motivating and ensuring compliance, and no nation has actually been able to fully comply with it. On September 1st, 1998, Enron's CEO, Ken Lay, wrote a letter to President Clinton asking him to shut down public debate on the matter and to establish a blue ribbon commission that, among other things, would vilify scientists who disagreed with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Now, that's a fact, not a conspiracy theory. He really did write that letter. Al Gore and his partner, David Blood, the former chief of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, founded the Chicago Climate Exchange, CCX, which was set up to make record profits, selling carbon dioxide offsets when a cap and trade bill would be passed by Congress. Speaking before a 2007 Joint House hearing of the Energy Science Committee, Gore told its members, quote, as soon as carbon has a price, you're going to see a wave of investment in it. There will be unchained investment. And through his company, the one that he ran with David Blood, so we had Blood and Gore, right? Anyway, he has increased his own net worth from $1.7 million when he was vice president to over $300 million. The four largest cap and trade systems currently in operation are number one, the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, which was established in 2005, and they have about 11,000 participants. Number two, the National Emissions Trading Scheme in China, with about 2,200 participants. Number three is the Korea Emissions Trading Scheme, which is East Asia's first mandatory trading scheme, with 684 participants. And last but not least, we have California's cap and trade program, started in 2013 with about 450 power plants and fuel distribution organizations. And then we have carbon offsets. In 1989, the World Resources Institute launched the first carbon offset program. This project involved planting trees. They figured that the trees would absorb the carbon dioxide that the polluters were responsible for emitting. However, when they're first planted, trees sequester hardly any carbon dioxide at all. They don't really begin to absorb much carbon dioxide in photosynthesis until they're about 20 years old. Mature and old growth trees are really the powerhouses of carbon absorption and storage. The idea of carbon offsets and trading had been toyed with even before 1989. Voluntary and mandatory plans were devised that allow companies to purchase carbon credits from projects designed to offset or balance carbon dioxide that they can't avoid emitting. This is a huge industry that hires thousands of people to design and manage these programs. There are several companies managing carbon offsets. Verra, Climate Partner, Rise Strategy, United Energy Trading, and South Star Energy Services are just a few. The largest company running the system is Verra, which has issued offsets for Disney, Shell, Gucci, and other big corporations. Verra has established standards for carbon offsets and has administered 3/4 of them. Using Verra's algorithms, other organizations working on these projects estimate how much carbon dioxide a certain project will save. They figure out how many trees will absorb a certain amount of carbon dioxide, and then they promise not to cut down those trees for a set amount of time, perhaps 50 years. When buying airline tickets, people can purchase offsets to assuage their guilt for increasing their carbon footprint. The Guardian reported a 9-month investigation using satellite images, which found that over 90% of rainforest carbon offsets issued by Verra were for saving stands of trees that didn't actually exist. And these are called phantom credits. 2 other studies concluded that 94% of these credits didn't benefit the climate at all. The Guardian also reported, quote, emissions trading was supposed to save the planet, but fraudsters quickly learned how to rip the system off, making themselves spectacularly rich. And then some of the major players started turning on each other. Another article about this scam appearing on the Greenpeace website described a COP29 conference that was recently held in Baku. This is what they said. The last few years have seen scandal after scandal in the schemes of false solutions, from ineffective projects to exploitations against indigenous peoples. As might be expected, some of these offsetting projects have seriously violated human rights. The Guardian viewed videotape evidence that as part of one of these projects, people in Peru were evicted from their homes that were then cut down with chainsaws and ropes by park guards and police. In these reforestation projects, local governments have been enticed to impose hefty fines of thousands of dollars on their citizens for cutting trees down. This practice, called neocolonialism, has a negative impact on local people's daily lives. Farmers in Brazil lamented that they don't have enough lumber to build their homes. People want us to starve to reduce carbon emissions, they complained. Georgetown University professor and philosopher Olufemi Taiwo believes that richer countries are dominating less powerful countries and people through these initiatives meant to slow the pace of climate change. He calls this new form of neocolonialism climate colonialism. The Global South is a group of nations with a relatively low level of economic and industrial development that are typically located to the south of more industrialized nations. Rich countries are investing in the Global South and dictating how to maintain land and forests to people who have lived there for, in some cases, thousands of years. At the Glasgow COP26 conference in 2021, Indigenous defenders declared that the climate solutions under discussion were not only false, but that they extended colonialism using land grabs and displacement of native people in the Global South. Luis Arce, president of Bolivia, pointed out important concerns about how the UN uses carbon offsetting to impose rules on marginalized countries by leaders of powerful industrialized countries. He calls this practice the new carbon colonialism. A parallel conference, the People's Summit for Climate Justice, was held near the convention center where COP26 was being held to call attention to these injustices. And I'll bet you never heard that on the mainstream media. Reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, which is REDD+, is a United Nations-backed program designed to mitigate climate change by preventing forest destruction. But a 2022 University of Cambridge study revealed that in these projects, Vera had overstated the threat to forests by an average of 400%. In the booming trade of carbon offsets, sellers are flooding the market with worthless products. We can see that the claims of saving vast swaths of forest from the chainsaw to balance emissions are overblown, declared Professor Andreas Conte-Alone from Cambridge's Department of Land Economy. This is a big business from which undeserving people are getting rich. And subsidies, a huge amount of taxpayer money devoted to climate change, disappears into subsidies. Subsidies are gifts or grants of money to an industry to encourage its existence. In doing this, governments influence purchases, propping up industries like ethanol, solar, and wind power. This is how politicians can pick winners who support their campaigns. Without subsidies, the winners simply couldn't compete in the free market. This gives governments tremendous power. Billionaire Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway verified this in a statement. We get a tax break if we build a lot of wind farms. That's the only reason to build them. They don't make sense without the tax credit. So he was honest about that. Forbes magazine estimated that just during Barack Obama's first term of office, about $150 billion was spent on so-called green energy subsidies. This didn't include the tax subsidies providing homeowners a 30% tax credit for wind and solar power installations, and that was about $8 to $10 billion a year. Without subsidies and mandates, intermittent wind and solar could never compete with reliable energy like coal, natural gas, and nuclear power, which still provide about 80% of all the electricity generated in the United States. They are not renewable because they're made using fossil fuels, and they last only 30% as long as coal and natural gas generating plants. Fiberglass wind turbine blades cannot be recycled. They must be buried in the ground. Even with subsidies, many of these wind and solar projects haven't been able to survive financially. A case in point is Ivanpah, located in the Mojave Desert. Its thousands of mirrors reflect sunlight onto a tower that's filled with a fluid that heats up and generates steam to run a turbine. This plant never worked as well as had been advertised. Ivanpah quickly became known as an expensive bird-killing eyesore. About 5,000 birds flying over Ivanpah have been killed by the heat reflected by its mirrors. These poor birds actually catch on fire. And also, this project has taken over a tortoise habitat. It is scheduled to close in 2026. In 2011, the Department of Energy gave Ivanpah a $1.6 billion loan guarantee. Ivanpah's owners were exempted from the standard credit subsidy cost and were granted several loan extensions by the Department of Energy. These loans have still not been fully repaid. And then in 2014, Ivanpah received a $539 million federal grant from the Treasury Department. Despite this massive financial lift, Ivanpah didn't even meet its energy output goals. Benjamin Zeiger of the American Enterprise Institute notes that, quote, when fully operational, it was supposed to generate about 1 million megawatt hours of power annually for 2025 to 2023. The actual annual output has averaged 700,000 megawatt hours. Claims by politicians about job creation often distort the truth. Ivanpah did create about 1,000 temporary construction jobs and 60 permanent jobs on site. It cost taxpayers $36 million for each permanent job created. Treasury Department figures show that subsidies for wind and solar dwarf all other energy-related provisions in the tax code, costing $31.4 billion in 2024 alone. And future expenditures to taxpayers from 2025 to 2034 are estimated to be $421 billion. That's almost $500 billion. Just in the last 10 years alone, subsidies for wind and solar increased by 21 times the cost of the investment tax credit, ITC, and production tax credit, PTC. The primary drivers of wind and solar energy deployment are the most expensive energy-related provisions in the federal tax code. And here's the real hockey stick. I got this graph from Robert Bryce. In the last 10 years, since 2015 to 2025, it went up over 21 times. And I checked that too, and that's correct. It was actually more than that. So that's the real hockey stick. On August the 7th, 2022, the Senate passed the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, on a 51-50 vote, with all Democrats voting in favor, all Republicans voting against, and Vice President Kamala Harris breaking the tie. Research by the Kyoto Institute indicates that the IRA's total green energy subsidies will likely cost us between $2 trillion and $4.7 trillion by 2050. This is about 3 times the cost originally projected by Congress. Although some congressional representatives want to repeal the IRA, the Institute for Energy Research doesn't believe the subsidies will end anytime soon. Added to that was the money spent by the 29 states that have mandates forcing public utilities to buy expensive green energy, requiring over 1,000 times as much land area as coal, natural gas, and nuclear for every megawatt of power, 1,000 times as much land. This doesn't include also the tax credits for electric vehicles. We can't forget about that. Projected to cost us taxpayers $105.7 billion between 2025 and 2034. In the United States, subsidy for purchasing an electric vehicle was doubled to $7,500 by the Inflation Reduction Act. In 2023, the total subsidies for electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles amounted to $45.3 billion worldwide. Only the rich can afford battery-powered vehicles. This means that those of us who don't have the money to buy them are helping to support the rich, who are getting subsidies paid for by our tax dollars. The owners of EVs also avoid the federal road tax that the drivers of internal combustion ICE vehicles must pay when they buy gasoline. This is ironic because battery-powered vehicles are heavier than internal combustion engine vehicles, and thus are causing more damage to our roads. A case in point about the devastating effect that these policies can have on a nation's economy is what happened to Germany. The new U.S. Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, recently remarked, Germany spent $500 billion, made their electricity 2 to 3 times more expensive, and they produce 20% less electricity today than they did 15 years ago. The Biden regime is following the same path. We're not going to go down that road. We want affordable, reliable, secure energy and a reindustrialization of America, not deindustrialization of America. And all of this is due to a hypothesis for which there is no real evidence. In fact, the thousands of leaked emails between climate scientists whose dishonesty shook the scientific community in 2009 and 2011 verified that there is no validity to climate change claims. Most people have never heard about these emails dubbed ClimateGate because they were completely covered up by the media and by politicians who had so much to gain from this so-called problem. In the last speech given by meteorologist John Coleman, founder of the Weather Channel, before he died in 2018, he noted, quote, "You've got to understand the supreme power of money. It is more powerful than the voice. It is more powerful than the idea. It is more powerful than the vote. Money runs our country. Money runs the world. And that money has funded over 10,000 papers on global warming." And taxes. Okay, governments were quick to realize that the climate change problem provided another great opportunity to rake in money. Taxes. Taxes on energy affect our entire economy. They're not just a tax on carbon dioxide emitters. All energy taxes on these companies are passed on to consumers as inflation and increased energy costs, higher prices at the pump, and higher gas bills to heat homes and businesses. Energy, whether fuel or electricity, is the foundation for virtually every step of a supply chain. The production of food requires tractors and other heavy equipment, uses diesel. The transportation of food from farmers' fields to factories that process the food and then to grocery stores is also powered by petroleum. Food processing facilities need huge amounts of electricity or natural gas. Refrigerating that food also requires electricity. These taxes on energy raise prices at every step of the supply chain. This has a compounding effect. The final cost of a product that you buy at a mall or grocery store has been increased multiple times by these energy taxes. It was estimated that energy taxes raise the cost of each part of a supply chain 64% faster than the rest of the economy. The Institute for Energy Research reported that in Canada, the Trudeau government instituted a carbon tax in 2019, starting at $20 a metric ton of carbon dioxide emitted by the power company or airline. By April of 2024, that tax had increased to $80 a metric ton, 4 times as much. By the year 2030, this tax is scheduled to be $170 per metric ton, more than 8 times as much. Residential electricity customers in Canada found that this carbon tax cost them more than if they were actually paying for the natural gas to heat their homes. In Ontario, where low temperatures are often minus 20 degrees below zero in Fahrenheit in the winter, one woman's gas bill included a carbon tax of $134. In Peterborough, Ontario, a restaurant was billed a carbon tax of $1,044 in addition to the regular heating bill. A man in Alberta was charged a carbon tax of $136 for a month, in addition to the cost of natural gas. He also had to pay a carbon tax of 17 cents per liter on gasoline for his truck. Because he uses 200 liters of gasoline per week, this adds $34 extra per week, amounting to $1,768 per year for this tax. And they said that Alberta is giving more to the government of Canada than any other province, even though they have vast energy reserves up there. These exorbitant and unfair taxes have forced some families in Canada to take up residence in campers to save on their heating bills. In 2012, a $25 a ton carbon tax was introduced in Australia. This 10-year plan would have cost $162 billion. The goal was a modest 5% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. This caused such extreme economic deprivation that the number of bankruptcies skyrocketed. The tax had to be discontinued. Because Australia's carbon dioxide emissions amount to only 1.2% of mankind's total carbon dioxide emissions, this reduction would have made a difference in the Earth's average temperature of only 5/100,000th of a degree after 10 years. And that's only if the IPCC figures are correct. If we extend these figures out to worldwide proportions, we find that the cost of reducing the Earth's temperature by only 1 degree Celsius would be 3.2 quadrillion, an astronomical figure. And this is assuming that the IPCC's figures are right, which they probably aren't. This cost spread out equally among the 8 billion people on Earth would amount to $400,000 US for every man, woman, and child. This graph, produced by the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, shows how each of the 9 carbon dioxide federal tax bills introduced in the United States Congress was designed to increase the tax on a ton of carbon dioxide with the passage of time. And you can see how they all go up over a period of years. That's the tricky part of it, right? Unfortunately, none of these bills was passed. Many companies and individuals are investing in solar and wind power. Other investors are focusing on so-called green initiatives like carbon dioxide offsets and battery-powered vehicles. Climate investments have tended to have lower returns. However, investors are assured that the gap is closing fast. According to the Institute for Business and Industrial Statistics, the 2 fastest growing industries in the United States are solar power and hybrid and electrical vehicle manufacturing. Even the oil companies are investing in renewable energy. Shell, for example, has spent about $2 billion, that's 1.4 billion pounds, since 2016 on this. That's because every renewable energy installation must be backed up by coal or natural gas. The hydrocarbon fuel companies stand to make billions of dollars on filling this need. Institutional investment brokers managing other people's pension funds are also putting huge amounts of money into the industry. Octopus, an investment management corporation, plans to plow $743 billion into renewables in the next decade. Net zero alliances. A net zero alliance is any global group of financial institutions, asset owners, or other stakeholders committed to achieving a net zero economy by 2050. The Net Zero Banking Alliance, that's NZBA, is a subset of GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is the world's richest climate alarmist organization. Headed by billionaire Michael Bloomberg, GFANZ controls collective assets under management of about $130 trillion. A forum for insurance transition to new energy is a UN-led multi-stakeholder forum that supports the acceleration and scaling up of voluntary climate action by the insurance industry and key stakeholders. This may be a ploy to change the wording of their coalition strategy to protect it from antitrust lawsuits. There's been a trend to higher insurance rates, especially in the solar industry, where property insurance premiums have risen by up to 45%. Insurers are becoming more selective about which solar manufacturers they will insure, citing manufacturing defect claims as a concern. Now, somebody installing solar panels better be careful about that. Climate Action 100 Plus is the world's largest and most aggressive investor initiative on climate change. Its 700 investors are intent on ensuring that 166 of the world's biggest corporate greenhouse gas emitters take the necessary actions to align their business strategies with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Since December of 2024, something really amazing has been happening. Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and Wells Fargo left the Net Zero Banking Alliance in an apparent reaction to right-wing criticism of ESG, which is environmental social governance policies. And I put a question mark there because that just seems unbelievable to me. Perhaps they can see that there is not much future for this industry. As time passes, it's becoming apparent to many that all of the climate predictions and tipping points made during the past 4 decades have simply not materialized, and alternate energy is not living up to its claims. BlackRock is a global investment management company and the world's biggest asset manager with $11.6 trillion under management as of March 31st, 2025. In November of 2022, 11 state attorneys general in the United States filed suit against BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street for violating antitrust laws. These asset managers working together acquired enough stock in every major coal company in the United States to dictate their policies. Using Climate Action 100+, they pressured these coal companies to fall in line with the green climate goals, to cut coal production in half by the year 2030. This deliberate reduction in the supply of coal increased energy prices across the United States, while at the same time producing dramatic increases in revenue for the asset managers. They are being investigated under the lens of antitrust laws, like the Sherman Act, enacted in 1890. This law was designed to prevent companies from engaging in practices that stifle competition, such as price fixing or limiting output. It prohibits contracts or conspiracies that restrain interstate or foreign trade and attempts to monopolize. Now, BlackRock has also left the net zero coalition of corporations that had pledged to reach net zero by 2050. BlackRock's money manager explained that membership in the group, quote, caused confusion regarding BlackRock's practices and subjected us to legal inquiries from various public officials. Wonder what legal inquiries those were. These collaborations restrict competition by influencing investment decisions, limiting the supply of fossil fuels, and otherwise interfering with market forces. These financial institutions have also colluded to exert collective pressure on businesses to reduce their emissions by withholding or threatening to withhold capital from these businesses. The House Judiciary Committee is also investigating Climate Action 100+ for antitrust violations. The outcome of this debate has significant political ramifications, since it would affect how companies collaborate on climate initiatives and how regulators approach these issues. In May of 2024, Climate Action 100+ lost 3 of the world's 6 largest asset management funds: BlackRock, JP Chase, and State Street. Some asset managers were concerned that this cartel was pressuring other companies too aggressively. BlackRock, State Street, and JP Chase together control about $18 trillion in funds. The UN Environment Program claims that its 450 member companies represent more than $100 trillion that are pledged to promote climate mitigation. This program appears to have been set up by the World Economic Forum. We know that the WEF has essentially joined with the UN. Is it any wonder that U.S. states' attorneys general believe that antitrust laws have been violated? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who claimed to be an outsider before the recent election, will be of much help. Because in 2020, guess what Mark Carney was doing? He was the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance. His comments on climate change were, quote, "We've retooled the financial system. We've changed the plumbing, if you will. The private sector needs to step up and say they'll help finance the $100 trillion transition that needs to happen over the next 3 decades. We need organizations like GFANZ that are relentlessly, ruthlessly, absolutely focused on that transition to net zero." Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, one of Canada's provinces, recently stated, quote, "We will no longer tolerate having our industries threatened and our resources landlocked by Ottawa." And there has been some talk, that Alberta might want to secede from Canada and maybe become its own country. The horrendous third quarter of 2023 for the wind and solar industry. On November 19, 2023, Shane Shiflett of the Wall Street Journal said, Wall Street rushed to embrace sustainable investing just a few years ago. Now it is quietly closing funds or scrubbing their names after disappointing returns that have investors cashing out billions. The third quarter was the first time more sustainable funds liquidated or removed ESG criteria from their investment practices that were added. According to Morningstar, that is a reversal from not that long ago when companies were rebranding faltering funds to cash in on the billions of dollars flowing into sustainable investment products. And I like to laugh the way they use the word sustainable. That's the opposite of sustainable. Despite these gains on the side of truth and justice, the politicians and climate investors won't go down without a fight. The push for world communism won't be so easily relaxed. The politicians won't admit that they were wrong and that the energy alternatives they've cast upon the world are an economic disaster. Since 2018, some business executives have been warning that the wind and solar industries would ultimately collapse due to their continued reliance on subsidies. Venture capitalist says that a quote, an Enron-style collapse is in store for renewables. And here's more proof that there is no climate crisis. If there was a real climate crisis, AI would not be allowed. According to an analysis by Alex de Vries, a data scientist at the Central Bank of the Netherlands, by the year 2027, NVIDIA is expected to send out 1.5 million AI server units per year. Well, they take a lot of energy. 1.5 AI server units would need at least 85.4 terawatt hours, which is 85.4 million megawatt hours of electricity per year. This would require an extra 100 huge solar power installations the size of Ivanpah. For the sheer amount of extra land required, this would be impossible. And then what about cryptocurrency? Crypto mining would never be permitted if there was a genuine climate crisis. Crypto mining uses huge quantities of energy, up to 2.3% of all electricity in the US, according to the Energy Information Administration. These mining facilities draw power from the grid and already threaten to cause brownouts and blackouts when demand was high. In Texas, this practice raised electricity prices by $1.8 billion. In Nebraska and Kentucky, utilities were required to buy expensive grid upgrades to accommodate crypto miners at everyone else's expense. If our federal and state policymakers really believed that carbon dioxide was causing the earth to heat up, this activity would be illegal. Have the lobbyists and other rich people who profit from data mining been twisting arms? Who's behind this? An essential part of the system, the grid, has been forgotten by most policymakers. In many cases, work on its expansion hasn't even started. To hook up all these renewable power sources we're going to need where they can be used, the size of our grid needs to be essentially doubled, lengthened by about 152 million kilometers, which is about the distance from the Earth to the Sun. This will require a massive investment, about $21 trillion. This would have to be done within 10 years if they're really serious about getting to net zero by 2050. And the grid we're using today needs to be upgraded because about 30% of it is over 50 years old. Doubling the grid will require about 427 million tons of copper, which is an extremely short supply. So it should be obvious to anyone researching this subject that the men who came up with the idea of cap and trade did so for financial gain. That means that climate change is really a political issue hiding behind the facade of science and environmentalism. The people who hatched this evil plan took advantage of the fact that the Earth has experienced a gentle warming up since the Little Ice Age, which was the coldest period in the past 10,000 years. and which ended about 200 years ago. Cities, urban heat islands, grew up around weather stations that were originally located in fields. Meanwhile, NASA and NOAA quietly adjusted older temperatures downward, corrupting the data and making it appear at first glance that the warming was more intense than it has actually been. These facts are clearly obvious to anyone researching the issue. So when you think about it, doesn't it seem strange that so many of the world's powerful people have invested billions and billions of dollars of other people's money into this devastating scam? Asset managers playing with people's retirement accounts have thrown them into this black hole. We can only wonder what's going on. Despite the fact that trillions of dollars have been stolen from the world's people, those in power now tell us that the coming apocalypse has not been delayed by even one day. The only solution, they say, is for us to end our use of hydrocarbons, which would mean the end of industrial production and life as we know it. Because this is a worldwide problem, we are being shuttled into globalism, which is a total takeover of the world's people. And here are some more facts. Bankers bullied Australia into net zero, threatening their interest rate by 1.5% if they didn't go along. Climate lobbying itself is a $2 billion per year industry, and oil companies are still making record profits. The numbers are small, but they're trillions. In reality, thousands of billions, to fund carbon schemes and fulfill bankers' dreams and disappoint millions and millions. And that is the end of my presentation.
Do you plan to write a book about this, or do you have any more books scheduled?
Well, you know, that's a good question. Probably what's going to happen in the end is I'll take all of this information I've been getting and make a second edition of my book.
Any other points you want to make before we do finish up here?
Main thing is, you know, this is a huge subject and some of it seems pretty unbelievable. So I hope people will just take this evidence and check it out.
All right. Very good.
I hope nobody will just walk away without doing something about it. The people over on the left, you know, they're the activists. And it seems like the people on the right are more tolerant and we don't get up and,
yes,
you know, protest and things like that. You should do that.
We absolutely should. All right. Thank you very much for all you're doing. You're doing fantastic work. Lynne Balzer. We'll talk to you next time.